We're, of course, still working our way through the Gospel according to Matthew. And here in Matthew's final section, at least as I've outlined his Gospel, coming to these concluding chapters. This is, of course, the final 3 chapters of Matthew, where we're really, getting into why Jesus came, to die and to rise again. We're getting into the very heart of the Gospel itself. And here in this section, to summarize it, especially the way Matthew writes it, but really this is, very much just the gospel. We see that Jesus, with sovereign humility, is murdered on the cross for the forgiveness of our sins and resurrected in victory to inherit God's kingdom. And of course, it's him inheriting God's kingdom and doing all of those things that allows believers to enter into his kingdom as well. So this is very much the gospel in the gospel according to Matthew. Now, as usual, I divide this into different portions just to handle it in more manageable chunks. And this first portion of Matthew's final section very much focuses on showing Jesus as being sovereign over his death. I know that I chase a lot of rabbit trails, especially in these parts of things, but that is, I think, the overall thrust of what Matthew's trying to get at as he narrates some of these final events of Jesus' ministry. And in this portion of thing, that's very much the case. And as part of this, we've been studying the Last Supper and the First Communion meal between Jesus and his disciples. And we've done a few sermons on this already. Let's go ahead and reread that passage. This is Matthew 26, verses 17 through 30. Now on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Where would you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?" And he said, "Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, 'The teacher says, my time is near. I am to keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.' The disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. Now when evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12 disciples. As they were eating, he said, 'Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me.' Being deeply grieved, they each began to say to him, 'Surely not I, Lord.' And he answered, 'He who dipped his hand with me in the bowl is the one who will betray me. The Son of Man is to go just as it is written of him. But woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born.' And Judas, who was betraying him, said, 'Surely it is not I, Rabbi.' And Jesus said to him, 'You have said it yourself.' While they were eating, Jesus took some of the bread, and after a blessing, he broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, 'Take, eat, this is my body.' And when he had taken a cup and given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, 'Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for forgiveness of sins. But I say to you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom.' And after singing a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives." As I've explained previously, I have a total of 6 or 7 messages that I want to do for this one passage. It is proven to be very heavy with things that are good to know and good to learn, which is why I'm taking so much time on it. This is going to be sermon number 3 on this particular passage, so not yet halfway through as of now, but we'll keep going, or at least I'll keep going, and you're welcome to join me. Now, so far, we've talked about various references to the Old Testament, which we find in this passage, and there are several. I've given special focus to the Passover meal, the festival that the Jews celebrate once a year, and the Passover, the festival of unleavened bread, which is kind of the larger part of it. You have the festival of unleavened bread is about a week, and then the Passover is the first day of that. These all celebrate the time when God delivered Israel from Egypt and from the final plague on Egypt. So specifically the plague on the firstborn, the death of the firstborn in Egypt, and how Israel was delivered from that by God. And the Passover commemorates that, when he passed over them and did not judge them as he did with the Egyptians. We've talked a lot about that. And today's message, number 3, continues this emphasis on the Passover. So we're not getting too far away from things we've already talked about, but really is more concerned about dwelling on some of the tension that we see between our 4 Gospels written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This is one of those times where the things they say don't easily jive with one another so well, and we've got to talk about that to make sure we understand what's going on. So the chief question for us today, as we deal with this passage, is, was Jesus crucified before the Passover meal or after the Passover meal? Which is a question that sounds like maybe a bit of a non-starter. Why would you even ask that, given what we just read here and now? But there are reasons to ask that question, and we'll get into all of that in this particular sermon. My sermon today is called Counting the Days, which is what we'll spend a lot of time doing as we go through this sermon. We're going to have a lot of emphasis on what day is it and things like that. So kind of one of those sermons, if you've not gotten the impression already. We're doing that kind of thing today. Ultimately, I want to argue something that, again, is going to sound really odd until you get toward the end of things. I want to argue that the year when Jesus was crucified might have had two Passovers. Might have had two Passovers due to some oddities with the Jewish calendar, which, again, we're counting the days. We're talking about calendars and things. So, again, that kind of sermon. I want to give you my outline ahead of time so you can track kind of where I'm going with all of this. And when we get more into the substance of things, you'll see why I'm proposing some of this very strange stuff you're hearing about. But here's the outline. 4 headings for today. First, I want to show you the actual tension, specifically between John's Gospel and Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because it's, again, one of those kinds of things where John is sort of doing his own thing and the other 3 are doing their thing. And what they say is a little bit difficult to reconcile at first. Secondly, I want to address the skeptical response to this tension. So talking about the kind of person that is maybe not a Christian or maybe not a very Christian strong of faith, so to speak, what they would say to this, the kinds of things they do say, and what can be said in response directly to that. I actually want to dwell on what they're saying and show how not good it is, how insufficient it is for dealing with these kinds of tensions. Thirdly, I want to discuss and dismiss the most common answer for this tension. There is something that I think Christians more often say when dealing with this particular problem that I have come to really, really not like. And so I want to just talk about it, first of all, because if you've heard anything about it, it's probably this. And so I don't want to leave it as a stone unturned. I want to talk about it and show why I think it's not the best way to answer it. And then finally, I'll end by giving you my answer and spend a lot of time on that, just really working out so you can see my reasoning behind it. And as you've already figured out, this is one of those things that I said I would do as we're approaching the very, very end of Matthew's Gospel. I said there was a large number of times where, just because the 4 Gospels all cover basically the same ground here at the end, we have more of these instances where they don't all say exactly the same thing, and therefore more difficult questions of that sort. And I said I would deal with these as I came to them, so this is me keeping my promise. At least I am an honest man in doing these sorts of things and keeping my word. But I do think all of this is a worthwhile side quest. Yeah, we're talking about counting days and Jewish calendar and all of that, but I think it's worthwhile to pursue these kinds of things, and this thing in particular. I don't want anyone here questioning the reliability of the Scriptures simply because of a confusion over the date of the crucifixion. There are so many hardships already, as we've already discovered in the first part of our meeting, so many things that might make a person turn away from God. I don't want to add yet another thing to that by not talking about a difficulty you're going to encounter just reading the Bible. I don't want to just leave that in your head to eat away at you. I don't want to do that. I also don't want to obscure the teaching of the Gospels that Christ, in his death for our sins, became a much better Passover lamb and instituted a much better meal than the Passover meal. I don't want some quibbling over dates and calendars to get in the way of you appreciating that glorious truth, those glorious truths. So I just want to clear away all of this and just let, one of these pictures that God has used to convey the eternal salvation we have in Christ. I want to let that picture through in full force and not have you asking, what day is it? I don't want that to get in the way of these things. So we're going to deal with this now and get it done so you can just enjoy what Christ has accomplished in his death. So for all those reasons, let's pursue this matter Let's get it done and move on to other, even more better things. So to start at the very, very beginning, what are we actually talking about as I mention these things? I want to show you this tension I have in mind here between John and the other three Gospels we have. 3 of our 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all imply that Jesus was arrested and crucified after he ate the Passover meal with his disciples. So they sit down, they have the Passover meal together. After that, he is arrested and crucified. That is what all 3 of those Gospels say. We saw it here in what we read this morning. Matthew 26, verse 17 through 21. Now on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?" Eat the Passover. And he said, "Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, 'The teacher says, my time is near. I am to keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.' The disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. Now when the evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12 disciples. And as they were eating, he said, 'Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me.'" And from there, Matthew continues to describe them leaving that location after the meal, the arrest of Jesus that very night, and his trial, his death on the following morning and afternoon. So, the timeline here is not difficult to follow in Matthew's Gospel or Mark and Luke, for that matter. Mark and Luke present the same basic order of events, along with the implication that Jesus was crucified after he ate the Passover meal with his disciples. So in Mark and Luke as well, Passover meal comes first, then Jesus is arrested and crucified. And Luke, I find, is even more specific on this, just in the way he words things. So I do want to read just a bit of Luke's account. This is from Luke 22, verses 7 through 16. And this will stand for Mark as well, just because Mark is very similar to both of these guys. But Luke 22, starting in verse 7, we see this. "Then came the first day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. And Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, 'Go and prepare the Passover for us, so that we may eat it.' They said to him, 'Where do you want us to prepare it?' And he said to them, 'When you have entered the city, a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house that he enters. And you shall say to the owner of the house, "The teacher says, where is the guest room in which I may eat the Passover with my disciples?" And he will show you a large furnished upper room. Prepare it there.' And they left and found everything just as he told them, and they prepared the Passover. When the hour had come, he reclined at the table, and the apostles with him. And he said to them, 'I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I say to you, I shall never again eat it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God.'" So Luke perhaps is even more plain than Matthew on what they're doing. They are eating the Passover. Jesus earnestly desired to eat that Passover meal with them. It was his goal for those last few days to make sure this happened. Luke is very plain on this point. Now, by itself, none of that is odd. He eats the Passover meal with his disciples, then he gets arrested, then he gets crucified. Simple, right? No problem. But when you compare these 3 Gospels with John's Gospel, the evident tension arises. This is where we hit the problem I'm talking about today. According to John's Gospel, Jesus was being put on trial before the Passover lambs were sacrificed and eaten. John gives a very different timeline. Jesus is already on trial and people haven't eaten the Passover meal yet. I want to read from John's Gospel. You can turn to John 18 if you want to follow me there. Let's read how John describes the Jerusalem authorities bringing Jesus before Pilate, the Roman governor, for his trial. So again, this is the trial of Jesus, further along the timeline, but the timeline is a bit confused. So let's read John 18, verses 28 and 29 here at first. And the they here are, I think, the priests in particular, but the Jerusalem authorities is who I have in mind. "Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the praetorium, and it was early. and they themselves did not enter into the praetorium, so that they would not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. Therefore Pilate went out to meet them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" The way John words that, the Passover meal had not yet been eaten, and the enemies of Jesus did not want to defile themselves before that holy meal by entering a Gentile building. They would have been ceremonially unclean going in there. They didn't want to be unclean because then they could not eat the Passover. They want to eat the Passover, so they're not going to go in there during the trial of Jesus. But don't miss the point there. I mean, the Passover hasn't been eaten yet. I mean, it's still future at this point, contrary to what we saw in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And John makes another similar observation later, which is perhaps even stronger on this point. Lest you think that maybe they're just celebrating a day late or something, it seems like that's not the case. It seems like the Passover has not yet properly happened yet. If you read John 19, verses 13 through 14, we see this. Therefore, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." What day is it? It's the day of preparation for the Passover. So the Passover hasn't happened yet. It's the preparation day for the Passover. The Passover lambs were sacrificed in the evening and then eaten later that night. We talked about all this in detail last time, how they go through all of that. According to John, the trial of Jesus happened during the preparation for that meal, and thus before the Passover meal. That is a very different timeline than what we see in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And therein lies the tension. That's the problem we're talking about today, and that's why I'm spending a whole sermon on counting the days. That's why we're here now. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are extremely clear that Jesus went to his death after he ate the Passover meal with his disciples. Luke even says it was his earnest desire to do that before he suffered. But according to John, we have something very different. Jesus went to his death before the Passover meals were eaten. So very different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew, Mark, and Luke take the opportunity to show how Jesus transformed the Passover meal into the Lord's Supper, communion, a new feast for a new covenant. I spent a lot of time on this. It's pretty noticeable when you sit there and compare the two meals and see the changes Jesus makes and how this is the beginning of what we do in our church meetings. So very big point for Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Meanwhile, John implies, perhaps with even greater clarity, that Jesus was being crucified at about the time when lambs were getting ready for the slaughter, which shows Jesus to be the true Passover lamb. And you hear people preach about that very often when they preach on John's version of it. They say, when Jesus was being tried and crucified, that's when the lambs were being slain, therefore Jesus is the true Passover lamb. It's like, yes, that's exactly what John means to say by that. But it's different than what Matthew, Mark, and Luke are saying. Each gospel makes a meaningful point about Jesus and makes that point very clearly, but they make different points with different timelines. So they're both very clear and they both have a lot to say, and it's all very useful and helpful to know, but they're different. The timeline is just completely different. And therein lies the tension that we're trying to address today. Now, as you can imagine, critics and skeptics of Scripture and the Bible have made use of this tension to call into question the reliability of the four Gospels. If you ask someone, why don't you believe the Bible, and they have anything substantial to say, they might go through places like this where you have these kinds of problems, and this might be one of them. So here in my second heading, I want to address that kind of skeptical response. Let's see what they say, and let's see if it's actually a good answer in and of itself. I want to spend some time on this. So according to that crowd of critics, this tension between the four Gospels is proof that somebody in the history of early Christianity simply remembered the wrong date when talking about the crucifixion of Jesus. They got the day wrong. Bless their hearts. They just couldn't get it right. Somebody got the day wrong and passed it along, and now we've got two different versions of when Jesus died. Now, at first, that suggestion sounds reasonable. It is, in fact, very commonly what you might say on occasions like this. Our four Gospels, between them, provide two dates for the crucifixion of Jesus. one of them before the Passover meal and the other giving the day after the Passover meal. So strictly different dates. When such a disagreement happens in everyday life, we assume that somebody just got the date wrong. I might say, oh, I saw so-and-so at Walmart yesterday, but it was actually the day before, and you find out later by comparing with the other person. That happens. People have slips of memory like that. And that's how you would immediately judge a situation like that, where two different people are giving you different dates for something. Somebody got the date wrong. But of course, this would strike a blow against the idea that the Gospels are the Word of God. We don't expect there to be mistakes of that kind in something that God has given us. Even if it is God working through human writers, it's still the Word of God, and we expect a higher degree of accuracy than that. In the very least, such a disagreement between the Gospels would undermine the reliability of the four Gospels for history, right? As you just try to plot things out as a historical document, you have proof in this case that you can't take everything they say with the utmost confidence because they do make mistakes, as the skeptics would say at this point. And that's exactly how a typical skeptic or critic of the Bible would address this tension regarding the date of the crucifixion. That's exactly what they would say. They would say, well, it's just human error, here in the alleged Word of God, and they would not accept it as the Word of God for that reason, most likely. Now, that is all exactly what they would say. I understand why they say that. But I think this critical explanation of this tension fails to meet the standard of actual common sense, which is amazing to say because it all sounds very sensible so far, if you were just judging this matter in a very neutral fashion. But I think the more you consider it, the less sense it actually makes. And I have three reasons for saying that. And I want to go through these because sometimes you have to answer the fool according to his own folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. That's a proverb, by the way. I didn't look it up where it is, but it's a proverb. You get on Google, you'll find out. But sometimes you have to do that. You have to answer the fool according to his folly. So that's what we're doing now. How would we answer them in the context of what they're trying to argue? Well, let's do this. Three things. First of all, I think it's unlikely that any of the first Christians could have wrongly remembered the date of the crucifixion when that day would have been etched clearly on their memory due to the great pain of that day, and more clearly etched on their memory by the great joy afterward of the resurrection. This would have been one of those days. This is one of those days when you remember what you were wearing, you remember what you had for breakfast, you remember what you were doing when you got the phone call. Something so terrible happened. It's one of those days. In the same way that the day of the resurrection would have been the exact opposite. One of those days where you're just so off the chart happy. It's just all so vivid in your memory. That's what we're talking about here. It's easy to stand back and say, oh, they got the date wrong, when you're just viewing it in this abstract way. But these were people who experienced the depth of gloom and the height of joy within about 3 days. You don't forget that stuff, especially not when it's happening, in the holiday season. If something terrible happens to you on Christmas, you remember it happened on Christmas. It's probably going to affect your view of Christmas ever afterward for that reason too. And if it's the day after Christmas, that's still close enough that you're going to remember, yeah, we had a nice Christmas, and then the day after, oh, this happened. That's how the human memory works. When you have an easy reference point like that, it just makes those things so much easier to remember. So that some early Christian just forgot the date of the crucifixion, no, that is not how human memory works when dealing with these kinds of emotions and these kinds of events, and even these kinds of calendar dates. So no, non-starter. But there are two more problems. We're not talking about, this is number two, we're not talking about the casual passing of information about trivial events. This isn't, I saw so-and-so at Walmart yesterday. Ooh, silly me, it was the day before. That's not what we're talking about at this moment. We're talking about the central event of a faith discussed with great urgency, originally in the context of great persecution, with a very deliberate effort to instruct new disciples in a community. Let's not forget, this is the blossoming faith of Christianity right here. These Gospels were written for that reason, to instruct new disciples in what happened, what to believe. Exactly. You don't just get the day wrong on stuff like that. This isn't the casual passing of information. This is an urgent, deliberate, weighty matter. You don't just get the day wrong. You ask around and make sure you have the right date before you put it in your book. Thirdly and finally, I'll remind you that both versions of this story have theological meaning, whether that's Jesus transforming the Passover meal into communion or Jesus dying as the new Passover lamb. Matthew, Mark, and Luke do the first one. John does the second one, a little bit more in their different directions. There's theological meaning either way. And that theological meaning would actually make it easier to remember the date in question. Like, these things are going to be tied together in their head. So that's just another reason why they wouldn't have gotten the date wrong. All that to say, the skeptics have once again failed to think clearly about what they are saying. This is the classic example of a guy in his armchair saying, well, I'll tell you what happened. This is what happened. It's like, but he's just kind of shooting the breeze and not really thinking about it. When you actually take the details of things that would have to happen, all of the implications of what they're saying, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's not a good explanation just to say that somebody forgot the day and got the day wrong. And so we have to forge a new explanation for this tension in the four Gospels regarding the date of the crucifixion. If the skeptical answer doesn't work, we got to find a new one. We got to make a new one somehow. Based on everything I have said so far, we are forced to argue a very difficult point, though. I mean, this is going to come with some challenges. I dedicated a whole sermon to it for that reason. We have to argue that the first Christians, from the very beginning, had two traditions about the date of the crucifixion, that this is how it started, that it was actually meant to be this way. Rather than arguing that somebody at some time made a mistake, I have to argue that both traditions are, as is, they are as old as the crucifixion itself and both valid. That this is how it was meant to be passed along from the very beginning. And that Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John are not making a mistake. They're not contradicting each other. They're not against each other. That this is how it was meant to be passed on. And that the explanation for that comes with the very date of the crucifixion itself. That from there, this happened and happened correctly. Now, most people who discuss this point of tension don't word it the way I just did, but that is what they try to argue, and you have to argue for that. You have to say that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are right. You have to argue that John is correct, even though they're saying different things about this. You have to do it that way. Now, I would like to review how Christians have dealt with this, and I have basically two theories to give you, starting with one that I don't like, but which I do want to talk about. So let's move on to the third heading and do that as a starting point for this. So here in my third heading, I'm going to give you an overview of the most common argument that is usually made to explain what the four Gospels are doing. But it's also the one that I find least compelling. Like many Christians, I believed this for a long time. And then again, I basically got out of my armchair and did the work and figured out this is not a good explanation. So let's talk about it and just be sure you understand why I'm rejecting this. So most commonly, Christians will argue that the tension between the Gospels on the date of the crucifixion arose because, allegedly, northern Jews from Galilee and southern Jews from Jerusalem had different methods for reckoning days. And I'll say that again. Allegedly. This is just alleged. This is just them saying this. Northern Jews from Galilee and southern Jews from Jerusalem had different methods for reckoning days. And of course, Jesus and his disciples are mostly from Galilee, whereas the enemies of Jesus, especially the authorities, are mostly there in Jerusalem. So they're on different sides of that line, north and south. Now, for all of this, I was going to give you a handout. I decided against it. Maybe if you need more help kind of visualizing this, I can show you that. I just decided against it. But here, let's just talk about this, maybe coming to something very mundane that maybe you take for granted. Let's ask this question. What time does a new day begin? How would you answer that in your head? When does a new day start? Well, it's actually a more difficult question than you might think. I mean, for our reckoning, you might say sunrise. You might say midnight. Wouldn't both be kind of correct? And don't we kind of function according more to one or the other, depending on things? Okay, well, the argument goes like this, that back then, there was a difference of opinion between northern Jews and southern Jews on this very question. When does a new day begin? So according to these people, southern Jews living in and around Jerusalem reckon days from sunset to sunset. So the new day begins, the old day ends, the new day begins when the sun sets. And that is when you flip the calendar, so to speak. So accordingly, southern Jews, like in Jerusalem, thought that way about days. Meanwhile, allegedly, northern Jews living in Galilee preferred to reckon days from sunrise to sunrise. So when does the old day end and the new day begin? When the sun comes up. That is allegedly how the northern Jews from Galilee reckon days. Now the result of that alleged contrariness was that Jews from the north and the south never agreed as to what day it was, ever. And of course there are a lot of cultural differences between those two parts of the land of the Jews that get mentioned quite often, but this would be just one of them. They don't even agree how to reckon days. They can't even agree what day it is. They're that contentious, right? Specifically, every date on the calendar would come one day sooner for northern Jews, including festival days, which is where this whole explanation comes in to talk about the Passover and things like this. According to this option, according to this suggestion, Jesus and his disciples from Galilee celebrated the Passover one day sooner than the Jews in Jerusalem because they both worked from different reckoning of days. They were kind of following different customs for their calendar, and therefore Jesus and his Galilean disciples were eating the Passover meal a day earlier than Jesus' opponents there in Jerusalem. That's how this explanation works. Therefore, Jesus ate the Passover meal with his disciples during the Galilean Passover, and then was crucified the next day as all the southern Jews were preparing their lambs for their Passover meal. And this is how you explain both Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are giving more of the Galilean perspective, and John is giving more of the southern Jew, Jerusalem perspective. That's how this explanation works. That is the most common explanation I have heard Christians give to explain this tension. Although it is the most common proposal that I hear, I am largely against this option. I do not think this is the right way to go about it. First and foremost, I want to stress that this proposal is only a proposal. None of it is factual. None of it is a fact. I feel like that very, very often doesn't come across when people give this answer. Very often when I hear Christians talk about this, I most often hear it taught as though we know Jews had different methods for reckoning days, as though this is a matter of historical fact that any historian or archaeologist might know. The truth is, we do not know that. We do not know that Jews from the north and south reckon days differently. We have absolutely no proof of that from any other ancient source. Not Josephus, not the Mishnah, not any of the other Jewish sources that I very often cite for you. It is not by any means a fact. It is a guess, educated guess, but it is a guess nonetheless. In fact, the only actual evidence we might have for this is this very tension in the four Gospels. The fact is, if Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John had all said exactly the same thing on this point, we would not even be talking about northern Jews and southern Jews reckoning days differently. The whole reason that theory came about is because of this problem. So it's one of these things that is, it's a theory that has arisen to explain one particular problem, which automatically makes me suspicious of it. I just don't like it when that sort of thing happens. Nonetheless, just know this, it's not a historical fact that Jews differed on how to reckon days at this time. We don't know that. There is no proof of that, no hard proof. But also, and I want to make this point, and this just brings it back again to common sense. Just like I did with the skeptics a few minutes ago, let's assess this from a common sense perspective. I fail to see how such a disagreement over days could have arisen and how that difference could have been maintained. Just think about this as though this were your life, where you live. You waking up every morning and asking, what day is it? And dealing with this confusion depending on who you're talking to. Imagine if in Missouri, everyone in the north thought it was Thursday, and everyone in the south thought it was Friday. Can you imagine how horrible that would be, how confusing, how absolutely impractical? Look, say what you will about people not being able to get along. We would get our heads together and we would make a solution to that problem. We would determine what day it is, and we would establish a method for always telling that so that this kind of confusion never happened again. That problem would not last. We would shoot it dead as soon as we possibly could. Now, some people have argued, kind of doubling down on this idea that the Jews had different methods of reckoning days. Some have argued that this trickiness was tolerated because it would allow the priesthood 2 days to sacrifice Passover lambs for the whole nation. Now, I'm sure that was a problem. You got a whole lot of lambs to sacrifice for a whole lot of meals, and spreading it out over 2 days would be really helpful. But let's not forget the implications of that for the rest of the year. That 1 day, or those 2 days rather, would be much easier, yes, but the whole rest of the year would be a confusing mess as people spoke to each other. They couldn't even talk to each other about what day it was. That just doesn't work. It is so totally impractical. So altogether, I think this option creates more problems than it solves and lacks any actual evidence, which makes me doubt it. There's no hard evidence that Jews actually reckon their days differently like this, and the implications of it are just madness. So no, absolutely not. I do not like this explanation. I know it's very commonly stated. It just doesn't work. It's just not a good theory. So I don't hold to this one. Which means I now have to tell you something else. I have to give you a better explanation, hopefully better. All right, so let's talk here at the end here about my preferred way of explaining this tension between John's gospel and the other gospels. Why do some of them say that Jesus was arrested and crucified after eating the Passover meal, and why does the other one say that he was arrested and crucified before the Passover meal? How do we explain this? Well, I want to argue, and it may sound like I'm doing something even more ridiculous, but hear me out. I want to argue that the year when Jesus was crucified might have had 2 Passovers, officially recognized Passovers, more than one. Now, let me just go through this in this very slow way. I've spent a lot of time on this just because I don't want to rush past anyone's thinking. I want to just make sure we're all working out the details of how this would play out. Let's begin simply with the desires that Jesus himself would have had at this time. As we saw from Luke's gospel, he said that he earnestly desired to eat that Passover meal with his disciples. So what does Jesus desire, and how does that shape what's going on here? Well, I think Jesus wanted to celebrate that Passover with his disciples and do so as early as possible because he knew he was about to die. Let's not forget that Jesus is aware of what's happening. Just to go back to the very beginning of Matthew 26 and reading verses 1 and 2, when Jesus had finished all these words, he said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man is to be handed over for crucifixion." Jesus knew this was coming. He is very aware of the time frame he has. So let's make some reasonable assumptions. Let's assume that Jesus knew he was going to be murdered as the true Passover lamb. Let's also assume that Jesus really wanted to have that last Passover meal with his disciples to transform it into the Lord's Supper. He wants to do 2 things. He wants to have that last meal with them and transform the Passover into something more meaningful for the new covenant, but he also really wants to make sure this whole Passover lamb thing doesn't get missed, and he wants to die when the Passover lambs are being sacrificed. How to do both? How do you do both? It's not, how do you do both? The 2 desires are at odds with each other. However, they're both worthwhile to pursue, right? I mean, it would be great to do both. It'd be great to have that last Passover with his disciples and be there physically to transform it into communion. And it'd be great to die as the Passover lambs are being readied for the slaughter so that, again, it's not missed on people, the significance of Jesus' death. If there were any way, if Jesus saw any way to make both happen, he would make both happen. He would really organize his calendar, his schedule. It sounds really vain to put it that way, but he would make sure that things would play out in a way that both could happen. The only question is, was there a way to do both? Is there any possible way to make this happen? To exploit both aspects of the Passover and make them work? Now, some Christians at this point are content simply to say that Jesus decided to celebrate Passover one day early, even if nobody else was. Kind of like a situation where maybe Christmas Day comes around, but it's just not a good day for your family to meet, and so you decide to meet, the prior weekend or something like that. Celebrate Christmas early so we can all be together. There are some Christians that approach this question exactly like that. That the Passover meal that Jesus had with his disciples was actually eaten early. There are some that say that, and they're very content to say that. I am not satisfied with that. I am not content to say that, mainly because of how our Gospels talk about it. Let's just review again some passages I already read, just very quickly to see how they talk about these days. They seem like they're official Passovers, not just eating early or something like that. Matthew 26:17. Now on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?" So on the first day of unleavened bread, not before, not early, it's on the first day of unleavened bread. And then John, the way he words it in John 19, I already read this to you, but here we go again. Therefore, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out, sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. Matthew calls that day the first day of unleavened bread, as though it was the official day for it. He doesn't describe it as Jesus eating early. He describes it as being the first day of unleavened bread. But then John says that the next day was the preparation day for all of that, which again makes it sound like another official Passover. It's like Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, Preparation Day, Passover Day, same kind of thing. These are the official days. So we need to do better than just say that Jesus decided to eat the Passover meal early so we could share it with his disciples. That would be very convenient, but I just don't think it fits the evidence we have in front of us. It doesn't fit the way that these gospel authors write what they're writing. To make all of this work, we really need somehow 2 Passovers. We need 2 Passovers back to back on 2 different days in 1 year without creating a ridiculous calendar, or at least a calendar that is beyond the historical evidence we have. We need some way to do that. Can we do that? So let's ask a follow-up question. Was there any precedent for having multiple Passovers in a given year? And I'm going to talk about this because some of you are perhaps already thinking this, so I do want to talk about it. The answer to that question is yes, but not in the sense we really need. I want to show you what these possible answers might be and then show you why I don't think they go quite far enough. Let me show you 2 of them. So the first example comes straight from the law of Moses itself, with one event later in Scripture that very much matches what this is talking about in the law of Moses. So I'll just read very quickly. This is Numbers chapter 9, verses 4 through 11, just talking about the laws of these festivals that the Jews have. Numbers 9, starting in verse 4. So here we are. So Moses told the sons of Israel to observe the Passover. They observed the Passover in the first month on the 14th day of the month at twilight in the wilderness of Sinai. According to all that the Lord had commanded Moses, so the sons of Israel did. But there were some men who were unclean because of a dead person, so that they could not observe the Passover on that day. So they came before Moses and Aaron on that day. Those men said to him, "Though we are unclean because of a dead person, why are we restrained from presenting the offering of the Lord at its appointed time among the sons of Israel?" Moses therefore said to them, "Wait, and I will listen to what the Lord will command concerning you." The Lord said to Moses, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, if any one of you or your generations becomes unclean because of a dead person or is on a distant journey, he may, however, observe the Passover to the Lord. In the 2nd month, on the 14th day at twilight, they shall observe it. They shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs." So we see that the law itself allowed people to celebrate the Passover 1 month late if they were unclean on Passover. So if it comes about that you are ceremonially unclean, defiled on that day, you can wait another month and do a Passover by the book and be completely blameless in that regard. And if you want to read 2 Chronicles chapter 30, you can see King Hezekiah actually exercising this option when he wants to renew observance of the Passover. He had to do it a month late because they weren't ready, but they got it done, right? And according to the law in most respects. So there's one example of having 2 Passovers in a year, perhaps. The second example I'll just mention briefly. This comes from the book called the Mishnah that I've talked about, here and there as I've gone through the Gospel of Matthew with you. The Mishnah is the written form of the traditions of the elders that you sometimes see the scribes and the Pharisees talk about. It was written down about the year 200. The Mishnah actually records that some rabbis allowed people to slaughter Passover lambs 1 day late. So not a month late, but a day late. And that would be a back-to-back Passover celebrations, right? So how helpful are these examples? I mean, do they help explain what we're seeing in the 4 Gospels? Not really. They're not definitive. One of them is, 2 Passovers celebrated months apart. So that's not as helpful. 2 months apart. One month apart, 1 month apart. So not exactly what we're seeing in the Gospels. But in both cases, the real Passover happens on the 14th day of the first month, right? And everyone else is just celebrating late, for some reason or other. They're just behind schedule. It's not really a situation where you have 2 days back to back that you could rightly call Passover and Passover. What we're seeing in these examples is Passover day, makeup day. That's more of what we're seeing in these passages. So it's not quite what we need. Some people might be content with these sorts of things and just leave it at that. I need more. I need more to satisfy my conscience on this. So let's go a little bit further than any of this. And this is where I'm really going with all of this. Let's ask another question. What if that year's Passover was subject to some widespread confusion as to the proper day for it? What if people didn't actually know the proper day of the Passover on that year and so had to kind of pick a day? And some picked one day, some picked the next day. What if that happened? Now, humor me, people, humor me. Just know I put a lot of work into this, so I'm going to say it whether you like it or not. Let's talk about how the Jewish calendar actually works. What are we talking about here? What is their calendar? How does it actually work? The Jews had and still have to this day a lunar calendar. It is a calendar based on the moon. The months and the days are determined entirely by the phases of the moon. We use a solar calendar. We base it on the sun. That's different. The Jews use a lunar calendar. It's based on the moon. Now, when the moon becomes a new moon, that is when the moon is all black, you can't see any of it, none of it's glowing. When the moon becomes a new moon, that day is the first day of a new month in the Jewish calendar. So when there's a new moon, that's day 1 of a new month for you. That's how the calendar works. In ancient times, Jews required multiple witnesses from multiple locations to declare that they had seen the new moon in order to declare the beginning of a new month. So when it got to be about time for a new month to roll around, men would actually stay up watching the moon to see if they observed clearly that there was that it was a new moon. They make sure that they saw it so they could say, yes, we have seen it. This is day 1 of a new month, official. And this is how they handled it. Now, this system usually worked well enough. For us, it seems like kind of a hassle. I mean, we know what day it is because of this, right? So this seems kind of like a mess from our perspective. But for them, it worked well enough, usually. The one big problem was cloud cover. If it is a cloudy night, you don't know what the moon's doing. You don't know if it's a new moon. You don't know if it's a crescent moon. You don't know what's going on. If there's too much cloud cover out there, you have no idea. And if you have a series of cloudy days and cloudy nights, you might not be able to see the moon for a while to know what day is the first day of the month. You know that a new month has to be starting at around this time, but what's day 1? Was it Thursday? Was it Friday? Was it Saturday? You don't know. You have no idea. It's pandemonium. They don't know what to do with themselves. But in those cases, the Jews still had to move their calendar forward with a new month. But they would have had to have guessed what day was the first day of the month. So they made the best guess they could. And you know what? Some people guessed differently. You go to the town down the road a little bit, and their witnesses are like, oh, no, I think I had a bit of a glimpse through the clouds, or maybe I saw that it was a new moon. And they're going to disagree on this. This does happen. And they might disagree over what day was the first day of the month. And if that disagreement happened on a festival month, when one of the Jewish festivals was taking place, they would also disagree on the proper date of that festival. When do we celebrate this holy day? Is it Thursday? Is it Friday? There's no good answer to that because no one had a clear enough view of the moon to know what day was the first day of the month. And this is not hypothetical. I did find one example, at least, in the Mishnah where this sort of thing happened. This one concerned the Day of Atonement. So the day of the year where they offer that sacrifice that's supposed to atone for the whole nation's sins that year. There was a year where, because of a confusion over the first day of the month, they didn't know what day the Day of Atonement was. They couldn't figure it out. They just had to pick one. And throughout the nation, you're supposed to be fasting and afflicting yourself on that day. So some people fasted on one day, some people fasted on the next day. And the high priest just chose one and said, well, I guess we got to do it sometime, so here, best guess. This kind of thing happens when you use a lunar calendar, which is why most of the world uses a solar calendar. But nonetheless, this was the problem they had. So let's bring this back to the time of Jesus and the question before us. Does this help us answer what Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John are doing and why they are different on this? Perhaps that month was one of those times when the proper date of the Passover was unclear due to cloudy skies obscuring the moon. They couldn't tell what day was the first day of the month. Therefore, they couldn't tell for sure what day was the 14th day of the month later on to have the Passover. The question then arises, when should we have the Passover? Well, you just kind of do what you got to do. Pick one day and go with it. And the priests are going to have to accommodate people showing up, on one day or the other to have their lamb sacrificed. But as for Jesus, what does he do? He's like, aha! This is a way to satisfy my desires, my two conflicting desires. He knew he was going to be crucified soon. And he knew it was coming in X number of days. So he can't observe the meal on the day he's being crucified. So what day is he going to pick for the Passover? The first of the 2 days. He picks the first of the 2 days to sit down with his disciples and have that meal so he can fulfill that desire he has to sit down with them and transform the Passover into the Lord's Supper, into communion. And then that leaves the second Passover day for being crucified as the true Passover lamb, while all the other lambs are being led to the slaughter. This allows Jesus to do both things that he wants to do. It explains how the two sets of Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, are saying different things. It makes sense out of all of this. And both days would be considered valid Passover days because nobody knows when the first day of the month was. They have to treat them both as two valid Passovers. Preparation Day, Passover, also Preparation Day, Passover. They have to do it that way. They have no choice, simply because there was a cloudy sky around the first of the month and they had no choice but to accept a little bit of leeway this year regarding this Passover. If we take all of these observations together, we have a good explanation for why 3 of our Gospels record Jesus eating the Passover meal with his disciples, while John's Gospel records that Jesus died before the Passover meal. It makes sense of everything, and it doesn't throw the Jewish calendar into more confusion than it already has. And that is my explanation for this. And of course, the real lesson here, just looking at all this from a kind of bird's eye view, is that Jesus knew exactly what he was doing. Just like, man, he was able to actually make both of his desires come true because he knew the timeline of his death, and he knew that he could have the meal on one day and then die the next, and everything would turn out exactly the way he wanted. Jesus knew. Play that into this whole theme of sovereignty that I have going on here through these particular sermons in this part of Matthew. All right, so now you can see why I call the sermon Counting the Days, right? This is what we've been doing. We spent a lot of time counting days and studying how other people counted the days and the Jewish calendar and alleged Jewish calendar and all that kind of thing. But the real point here is that Jesus himself was counting the days. He counted them perfectly and acted according to all that he needed to do before he was crucified, with complete, total sovereignty over this situation. Messy as it was with everyone trying to figure out when to have their Passover meal. Jesus, he knew exactly what he was doing and he did it. So let me lay out to you the outline that I gave you just one more time and then we'll be done with this. So first I laid out the basic tension between our four Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very clear that Jesus went to his death after he ate the Passover meal with his disciples. However, John says something different. John says Jesus went to his death before the Passover meals were eaten. Secondly, I described why the normal skeptical response to this tension is lacking, is just not sufficient to deal with this. Critics of the Bible often claim that somebody just got the day wrong for the crucifixion of Jesus. But that explanation does not fit well with common sense once you truly examine how people remember things and how they treat days of such, gravitas import, if you want to put it that way. Well, thirdly, I talked about the most common explanation for all of this, and the claim is that Jews from the north and the south had different ways of reckoning days, so that in the north it was always one day sooner than it was in the south, and that's what's going on here. But I pointed out there's no actual evidence of that, and it doesn't really make practical sense for an entire year to be organized that way, year after year after year. It just doesn't make sense. So then I gave you my argument. I argued that Jesus chose to celebrate the Passover on the earliest possible date, and on that particular year, there had to be two legitimate Passovers, probably because of a confusion over when the first day of the month was, because of a cloudy sky obscuring the moon, which threw their calendar into a bit of a chaotic condition for about a month. And then they were all probably very thankful to spot the new moon clearly the next month and start everything over fresh, and that way they would know what they were doing. But for our purposes, that's enough to explain possibly why we have this discrepancy between Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John on this particular point. So next time, I want to keep talking about this same passage in Matthew, and I want to come around a little more clearly to this idea of sovereignty that I keep bringing up here and there. Still focusing on the same passage, I want to show you how he conveys his power over his death as he faces death. So that's what we'll be doing next time, same passage. Are there questions or comments about any of this before we make ready for the meal time?